Commander Chester Nimitz Jr. grips the periscope handles, knowing that the slightest sound from his ship will turn the ocean around him into a killing zone. It is October 1969, and he has positioned a nuclear submarine inside the territorial waters of the Soviet Union's most fortified naval bastion. He is there to watch a parade, but if he is discovered, the celebration above the waves will instantly become a funeral beneath them. The journey to this point of maximum danger began weeks earlier in the warm, safe waters of Pearl Harbor. On September 3, 1969, the USS Lapon cast off her lines and slipped away from the pier. To the casual observer standing on the Hawaiian shore, it looked like a routine departure. The submarine, a Sturgeon-class nuclear attack boat, moved with the heavy grace of a predator, her black hull gleaming wet in the tropical sun before she submerged and vanished. But this was not a routine patrol. The orders locked in the captain's safe outlined a mission so sensitive that only Nimitz and 3 of his most senior officers knew the true destination. They were heading north into the freezing, turbulent waters of the North Pacific. Their target was the Kamchatka Peninsula, a jagged finger of volcanic rock and ice that guarded the eastern flank of the Soviet Union. Specifically, they were targeting the Petropavlovsk Naval Base, the home of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. For the 107 men aboard the USS Lapon, the transit is a transition from the known world into a void of isolation. In 1969, the digital safety nets of the modern age do not exist. There is no GPS to tell them where they are with the press of a button. There is no satellite internet to send emails home. Navigation is a matter of mathematics and stars. Every 4 hours, the submarine must ascend to periscope depth. The quartermaster raises a specialized mast, snaps a reading of the stars or the sun, and calculates their position using trigonometry and charts. Between these fixes, they are flying blind, relying on the accuracy of their gyroscopes and the steady hand of the helmsman to keep them on course. As they push further north, the environment changes. The water grows colder, denser, and louder. The Pacific Ocean is not a silent place. It is filled with the groans of tectonic plates shifting, the chatter of marine life, and the distant mechanical thrum of commercial shipping. But as they approach the Soviet maritime border, the texture of the sound changes. The ocean becomes hostile. This is the domain of the Soviet anti-submarine warfare forces. The closer the USS Lapon gets to the coastline, the tighter the net becomes. High above the clouds, massive Tu-142 Bear reconnaissance aircraft drone through the sky. These 4-engine turboprops are designed to hunt American submarines. They patrol tirelessly, dropping patterns of sonobuoys, disposable listening devices that float on the surface and dangle hydrophones into the deep. If a submarine passes near one, the sound of its propeller is transmitted instantly to the aircraft above. To survive in this environment, Commander Nimitz orders the ship into a state of ultra-quiet. This is not just a switch on a console, it is a complete transformation of the way the crew lives. The submarine becomes a library. The ventilation fans are slowed to a whisper. The hydraulic pumps that power the periscopes and diving planes are managed with obsessive care. Non-essential equipment is shut down to reduce the electrical hum. The crew adapts their physical movements to the new reality. Men walk in stocking feet or soft-soled shoes to prevent the sharp click of a boot heel on a metal deck. They speak in low voices. In the galley, the cooks are careful not to clang pots or drop utensils. A heavy wrench dropped in the engine room creates a transient noise spike that can travel for miles through the water. In the game of acoustic hide-and-seek, that single metallic clang is enough to give away their position. The approach to Petropavlovsk is guarded by geography as much as by technology. The naval base sits behind the Kuril Island chain, a line of volcanic islands that stretches south from Kamchatka like a barrier reef. These islands were seized from Japan at the end of World War II, and the Soviet Union has turned them into a natural fortress. The channels between the islands are choke points. Soviet naval engineers have placed acoustic sensors on the seabed in these passages. These are listening arrays connected by cables to monitoring stations on the islands. They create an electronic fence, an underwater tripwire designed to alert the base if an intruder tries to slip through. Commander Nimitz knows the fence is there. Naval intelligence has provided him with charts estimating the locations of the sensors. But no fence is perfect. The ocean is a dynamic, chaotic environment, and Nimitz is counting on the forces of nature to provide him with a key. He studies the charts, looking for a specific gap in the sensor net. The intelligence briefers back in Norfolk had identified a potential weakness. Between two of the islands, the tidal currents run with exceptional violence. Millions of gallons of water are forced through a narrow, rocky channel twice a day. This rushing water creates acoustic havoc. It generates a background roar of white noise that blinds, or rather, deafens, the senses. It is a gamble. To use the gap, the USS Lapon must navigate treacherous currents that could slam the submarine into a rock wall or push it to the surface. And they must do it while the current is running strongest, using the noise of the water to mask the noise of their own passage. On October 10th, the USS Lapon reaches the threshold. The crew stands at battle stations, though no weapons are armed. The tension in the control room is palpable. The sonar operators are the most important men on the ship. They sit in the darkened sonar shack, headphones pressed to their ears, filtering through the cacophony of the rushing tide. They can hear the water tearing over the rocks. It sounds like a freight train. Somewhere in that noise, they have to detect any Soviet patrol craft guarding the entrance. Nimitz gives the order to proceed. The submarine slips into the channel. The currents buffer the hull, pushing the 4,000-ton vessel sideways. The helmsman fights the controls, making micro-adjustments to keep them centered in the deep water. They are riding a landslide of water, invisible in the roar. For an hour, they are in the throat of the danger. If a Soviet destroyer is waiting on the other side with active sonar, they will be detected the moment they clear the interference. But the screen remains clear. The white noise of the tide washes over them, shielding their reactor pumps and their propeller blades. Then the noise begins to fade. The water calms. They have broken through. The USS Lapon enters the Sea of Okhotsk. They are now inside the fence. They are operating in waters that the Soviet Union considers its private lake. This is the staging ground for the Pacific Fleet, a sanctuary where their ballistic missile submarines practice for nuclear war. But Nimitz does not stop here. His orders are to approach the base itself. He pushes the submarine forward, moving toward the Kamchatka coast. The water here is dangerous in a different way. It is getting shallower. In the deep ocean, a submarine can dive to 1,000 feet to escape. Here, the bottom is rising to meet them. On the night of October 11th, the USS Lapon reaches its final holding position. They are 12 miles off the coast of Petropavlovsk. This is the edge of the territorial limit, the line in the water that marks sovereign airspace and sea. Technically, they are just outside the legal boundary. But in the context of the Cold War, legal boundaries are fluid concepts. Soviet naval doctrine states that no foreign submarine can approach within 20 miles of a major base without being detected. They believe their security zone is impenetrable. By parking at 12 miles, Nimitz is already defying the laws of probability. He brings the ship to a hover. The submarine achieves neutral buoyancy, hanging in the water column like a dirigible. The crew settles in to wait. The next morning, October 12th, is Soviet Navy Day. It is a major holiday, a celebration of maritime power. Intelligence reports indicate that Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the architect of the modern Soviet Navy, will be in attendance. There will be a fleet review, a parade of ships steaming out of the harbor to demonstrate their might. This is the target. The U.S. Navy does not just want to know where the ships are. They want to see them. They want to know what the new radar arrays look like. They want to see the configuration of the missile tubes on the new submarines. They want the kind of technical detail that can only be captured by a camera lens less than a mile away. Nimitz prepares his approach. He intends to move from the 12-mile line into the 8-mile zone. He will be putting his ship directly in the path of the Soviet fleet as it exits the harbor. The risk is extreme. The harbor entrance will be swarming with security. Soviet anti-submarine helicopters will be sweeping the area ahead of the parade. Patrol boats with dipping sonar will be sanitizing the route. If the USS Lapon is detected, there will be no diplomatic protest. The Soviet rules of engagement for a submarine found inside their territorial waters during a high-security event are simple. Destroy the target. At 0200 hours on October 12th, Nimitz orders the ship to wake up. They move at bare steerage, the slowest possible speed that still allows the rudder to function. They creep forward, inching across the continental shelf. The sonar room begins to report contacts. The screen lights up with green traces. There are multiple vessels moving near the harbor mouth. Patrol craft are conducting box searches, driving in square patterns to sweep the area. Soviet submarines are moving into their parade positions. The water is crowded. Nimitz stands over the plot table. He watches the geometry of the threats. He's looking for the seams, the small pockets of dead space between the patrol sectors. He maneuvers the USS Lapon like a thief in a crowded market, slipping between the noise of one ship and the wake of another. As dawn approaches, the water turns from black to gray. The sun begins to rise over the Pacific, illuminating the snow-capped peak of the Koryaksky volcano that towers over the city of Petropavlovsk. It is a majestic, terrifying backdrop. Nimitz orders the submarine to periscope depth. This is the moment of greatest vulnerability. To see, they must rise to just beneath the surface. The hull of the submarine is massive, nearly 300 feet long. In the shallow water, the displacement of the ship can create a hump on the surface, a disturbance that can be seen by a sharp-eyed pilot. Up periscope. The oiled hydraulic hoist hisses quietly. The stainless steel tube slides up from the well. Nimitz crouches, snapping the handles down as the eyepiece clears the deck. He presses his face to the rubber cup. The lens breaks the surface. For a second, water washes over the glass, and then the view clears. The sight that greets him is breathtaking. The harbor is alive. Flags are snapping in the wind on dozens of warships. He sees the massive gray shapes of cruisers and destroyers lining up. He sees the black silhouettes of submarines on the surface. He is looking directly into the heart of the enemy's power, but he is not there to sightsee. The periscope is not just an optical device. It is the housing for a highly classified piece of technology that has been retrofitted into the submarine for this specific mission. It is a camera system designed to capture the secrets of the Soviet Union at high resolution. Nimitz cycles the handle, focusing on the harbor mouth. The parade is beginning. The giants are coming out to play, and the USS Lapon, silent and unseen, is waiting to take their picture. The periscope of the USS Lapon breaking the surface of Avacha Bay was the culmination of a mission, but the origins of that mission lay thousands of miles away in the windowless basement analysis rooms of the Office of Naval Intelligence in Suitland, Maryland. To understand why Commander Chester Nimitz Jr. was risking his ship and crew in the shallow waters of a hostile power, one must first understand the crisis of blindness that had gripped the American Naval Command throughout the late 1960s. For decades following World War II, the United States Navy had enjoyed a comfortable assumption of dominance. The Soviet Union was viewed primarily as a land power, its navy a coastal defense force designed merely to protect its flanks. But under the leadership of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the Soviet Navy underwent a transformation that stunned Western observers. Gorshkov was a visionary who intended to challenge the United States on the open ocean, building a blue water navy capable of projecting power far beyond the Soviet coast. By 1968, new shapes began to appear in the grainier images provided by high-altitude U-2 flights and the early KH-9 reconnaissance satellites. American analysts stared at photographs of shipyards in the Baltic and the Black Sea, trying to decipher the function of vessels that had no clear Western equivalent. They saw the Kresta-class cruisers bristling with missile tubes that did not match known configurations. They saw the hulls of the Charlie-class submarines, whose dimensions suggested a propulsion system that might leapfrog American technology. They saw the shadows of the massive Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarines, leviathans that seemed to defy the logic of existing submarine design. The view from space was valuable, but it was critically limited. Satellites passed overhead on predictable orbital schedules, a rhythm the Soviets knew well and exploited by covering sensitive equipment with tarps when they knew an American bird was overhead. Furthermore, the resolution of orbital photography, while impressive, could not capture the fine technical details that naval architects needed. A satellite looking down from space sees a flat deck plan. It cannot see the profile of a radar array to determine its scan angle. It cannot see the curve of a sonar dome to estimate its frequency. It cannot see the pitch of a propeller blade, the single most important factor in determining a ship's acoustic signature. To counter these new threats, the United States Navy needed more than overhead outlines. They needed to see the rivets. They needed to see the weld lines on the missile hatches. They needed the kind of intimacy that only comes from standing a few hundred yards away. Since they could not walk into the Soviet shipyards, they had to send a camera to the Soviet front door. The technology required to achieve this was not standard issue. The submarine force had conducted covert intelligence missions since the late 1940s, with boats like the USS Kochino and USS Gudgeon probing the edges of the Soviet Empire. But these early missions relied on standard periscope cameras, systems that produced grainy, low-contrast images that often required weeks of enhancement to be useful. The intelligence community needed a quantum leap in optical capability. That leap arrived in 1967 from the laboratories of the Naval Research Laboratory. It was designated the Mark 118 periscope camera system. This was not simply a camera attached to a lens. It was a massive, integrated imaging suite that fundamentally altered the anatomy of the submarine that carried it. Unlike previous systems that used standard 35mm film, the Mark 118 utilized large-format film stocks similar to those used in aerial reconnaissance. It featured precision optics that could resolve the hull number on a destroyer from 2 miles away in low light. It included infrared capabilities for night photography and a rapid-fire mechanism capable of capturing thousands of images in a single operational session without the need to surface and reload. It was less of a camera and more of a vacuum cleaner for visual data. Integrating this beast into a warship required invasive surgery. In January 1968, the USS Lapon entered the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. The official ship's logs and public statements described the visit as routine maintenance, a cover story designed to bore any foreign agents watching the harbor traffic. Inside the dry dock, however, the work was anything but routine. Shipyard workers with high-level security clearances gutted sections of the submarine's forward operations compartment. They installed the massive mounting brackets required to stabilize the Mark 118 against the vibration of the ship. They carved out space for climate-controlled film storage lockers, capable of holding reels upon reels of sensitive chemical film. Perhaps the most significant modification was the installation of a specialized darkroom. In standard operations, a submarine would take photos and develop them weeks later upon returning to base. For the USS Lapon, this was deemed insufficient. The intelligence was so critical and the window of opportunity so narrow that the mission planners needed immediate feedback. They installed a fully functioning photographic laboratory within the pressure hull, allowing photography specialists to develop test strips while the submarine was still submerged. If a picture was blurry, or if the angle was wrong, the commander could be told instantly, allowing him to adjust his position and try again. The modifications were classified under a security designation that exceeded top secret. Even the squadron commodores who ostensibly commanded the USS Lapon were not briefed on the full capabilities of the new systems. The boat was becoming a specialized instrument of national policy, a one-off hybrid of attack submarine and spy satellite. In March 1969, Commander Chester Nimitz Jr. received his orders to take command. The name Nimitz carried a weight in the Navy that was impossible to ignore. His father, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, had commanded the entire Pacific Theater during World War II, orchestrating the victories that destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, his son was being asked to return to the Pacific, not with a fleet of carriers, but with a single, silent boat. The selection of Nimitz was deliberate. Naval intelligence needed a commander who possessed not just tactical brilliance, but the specific kind of cold nerve required to operate alone in denied waters. They needed a man who could weigh the value of a photograph against the lives of 107 men. The mission briefing took place at the Sublint headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia. It lasted 3 days. Nimitz and his key officers were ushered into a soundproof room where the walls were covered with the latest satellite imagery of the Petropavlovsk Naval Base. Intelligence officers traced the patrol patterns of Soviet anti-submarine corvettes. They played the recorded acoustic signatures of the new Soviet patrol craft, teaching Nimitz to identify threats by the sound of their engines alone. They showed him the gaps in the acoustic sensor nets of the Kuril Islands, the gate of volcanoes he would later slip through. They explained the objectives. The Navy needed proof of the new missile systems on the Kresta-class cruisers, and they needed to confirm the existence and configuration of the Charlie-class nuclear submarines. But the most chilling part of the briefing came from a man who had been there before. Commander Samuel Day, a veteran of previous covert special operations aboard the USS Queenfish, sat across the table from Nimitz to deliver the reality of the rules of engagement. Day's warning was stark and stripped of any bureaucratic euphemism. He explained that once the USS Lapon crossed the 12-mile limit and entered Soviet territorial waters, the protection of international law evaporated. They would be spies in a sovereign jurisdiction. One mistake means capture or death, Day told him. The Soviet rules of engagement in their home waters are absolute. They do not fire warning shots. They do not hail you on the radio. If they detect a submerged contact inside their harbor defenses, they will attack to destroy. They will drop depth charges until they see oils or debris. There was no backup. If the USS Lapon ran aground or was disabled by an attack, the United States government could not acknowledge the mission. There would be no rescue fleet. The plausible deniability required to prevent World War III meant that Nimitz and his crew were expendable assets. Despite the gravity of the warning, Nimitz accepted the command. The mission was essential. The gap in intelligence was a vulnerability the United States could not afford. The Soviet Navy was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical reality steaming across the oceans, and the U.S. Navy was fighting blind. The USS Lapon departed Pearl Harbor on September 3, 1969. The crew loaded standard Mark 48 torpedoes into the tubes, but the real weapon was the glass eye installed in the periscope well. Sealed in the specialized compartments were thousands of feet of high-resolution film, waiting to be exposed to the light of the Soviet morning. As the submarine transited the Pacific, the technicians checked and rechecked the Mark 118 system. They calibrated the lenses, they tested the film advance mechanisms, they practiced the choreography of the photo run. The coordination between the officer of the deck, the helmsman, and the photographer. The submarine had to be perfectly stable. A change in depth of even a few feet could dunk the lens or expose the mast. By the time they reached the approaches to Kamchatka, the USS Lapon was no longer just a warship. It was a floating observatory, a precision instrument designed to steal the image of the enemy's soul. The refit at Mare Island, the briefings in Norfolk, and the weeks of transit had all been a prelude to the moment when the shutter would click. Back in the present, at periscope depth off Petropavlovsk, Commander Nimitz feels the vibration of the periscope handles. The technology is ready. The context is clear. The only variable remaining is the enemy. Through the glass eye of the Mark 118, the shapes of the Soviet fleet are beginning to sharpen, moving out of the harbor mist and into the frame. The intelligence gap is about to be closed, one frame at a time. At 0630 hours on the morning of October 12, 1969, the rising sun burned through the fog hanging over Avacha Bay, illuminating a spectacle of naval power that no American eyes were meant to see. Below the surface, the control room of the USS Lapon was bathed in the crimson glow of battle lighting. The air was still and heavy, recycled through the scrubbers one too many times, tasting of ozone and tension. Commander Chester Nimitz Jr. stepped back from the periscope stand, ceding the primary instrument to Lieutenant Commander Robert Chen, the submarine's intelligence officer. Chen was not a typical periscope operator. He had been specially trained in the operation of the Mark 118 camera system, learning to manipulate the heavy optics with the finesse of a portrait photographer. He snapped the handles down, locked his forehead against the brow pad, and signaled the start of the operation. "Camera running," Chen whispered. The faint, rhythmic whir of the film transport mechanism began, a sound barely audible over the hum of the ventilation fans, yet it marked the beginning of the most significant intelligence harvest of the decade. Through the crosshairs, the Soviet Pacific Fleet was waking up. The harbor entrance, framed by the volcanic peaks of Kamchatka, became a stage. The Soviet admirals had arranged the fleet review to impress their commander-in-chief, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who watched from a reviewing stand on the shore. They had lined up their ships in a procession of steel titans, intending to project strength. Instead, they were marching single file past the lens of an American spy. The first vessels to exit the harbor were the Kresta-class, guided missile cruisers. These were the new heavyweights of the Soviet surface fleet, ships designed specifically to hunt and kill American aircraft carriers. As the lead cruiser steamed past at a distance of less than 2,000 yards, Chen adjusted the focus and let the Mark 118 eat. The camera fired at 5-second intervals, capturing a stream of high-resolution images that dissected the ship from bow to stern. In the analysis rooms of Washington, naval architects had argued for months about the capabilities of the Kresta. They had estimated, based on grainy satellite photos and hull displacement data, that the cruiser carried 8 anti-ship missiles. As Chen rotated the periscope, tracking the ship's movement, the truth was revealed in startling clarity. The sunlight glinted off the launch tubes arranged along the superstructure. Chen counted them. He photographed the loading mechanisms. He documented the angles of the launch rails. The intelligence estimates were wrong. The Kresta didn't carry 8 missiles. It carried 16. In that single pass, the threat assessment for every U.S. carrier battle group in the Pacific changed. The Soviet cruisers possessed double the firepower the Pentagon had anticipated. They could saturate American defenses with a volley of missiles that would overwhelm the ID radars of the time. This was the gold standard of intelligence. Facts that could not be argued away, captured on film that would eventually be projected onto the walls of the Situation Room. Behind the cruisers came the destroyers. The Kashin-class vessels were sleek, aggressive ships, notable for being the world's first major warships powered entirely by gas turbines. This propulsion technology gave them rapid acceleration and high speed, earning them the nickname the Singing Frigates, due to the high-pitched whine of their engines, a sound that the USS Lapon's sonar operators were currently recording on magnetic tape. But the photographs revealed a critical vulnerability. As Chen zoomed in on the Kashin superstructure, the Mark 118 captured detailed images of the funnels and air intake systems. The configuration was distinct. American engineers, later analyzing these photos, would realize that the Soviet gas turbines suffered from severe cooling limitations. The intake geometry suggested that the ships would struggle in tropical waters, where hot air would reduce engine efficiency. It was negative intelligence, finding out what the enemy couldn't do. The photos suggested that while the Cation was a sprinter, it lacked the endurance for long-range operations in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean or the South Pacific without significant logistical support. The Americans were learning exactly how far the Soviet leash extended. The parade continued for hours. Chen worked with the stamina of a surgeon, his eyes burning from the strain of peering through the optics. Nimitz managed the submarine's depth with obsessive precision. The swells in the shallow water were unpredictable, threatening to push the huge submarine upward, exposing the sail, or downward, dunking the periscope lens and blinding the camera. "Down a foot," Nimitz would murmur to the diving officer. "Up a foot, keep her steady." The 4,000-ton submarine hovered on a knife edge of buoyancy, dancing in the blind spot of the Soviet fleet. But the procession of targets was not just a parade. It was a security operation. Interspersed among the capital ships were the sheepdogs, the patrol craft and destroyers, tasked with sanitizing the route. At 0900 hours, the rhythm of the photo shoot was shattered. "Sonar contact," the chief sonar man hissed from the darkened shack. "Destroyer, bearing 040. High-speed screws. He's turning toward us." Nimitz stepped to the plot table. A Soviet Skory-class destroyer, an older vessel but still lethal, had broken formation. It wasn't steaming in the parade line. It was maneuvering. It was beginning an anti-submarine warfare, ASW, sweep. "Down scope," Nimitz ordered instantly. The hydraulic hiss sounded like a scream in the quiet room. "Make your depth 400 feet. Rig for ultra-quiet. 5 degrees down bubble." The USS Leon nosed over and slid into the deeper water. The crew froze. In the sonar shack, the operators watched, the green line of the destroyer's acoustic signature grow brighter and wider. The Soviet ship was passing directly overhead. Then the ocean rang. Ping. The sound of active sonar is not a beep. It is a physical assault. It sounded like a sledgehammer striking the hull of the submarine. The sound wave traveled through the steel, vibrating the deck plates, hitting the crew in the chest. It was the Soviet destroyer lashing out into the dark, feeling for a metallic return. Nimitz stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the depth gauge. The destroyer was pinging, but was it a search or a lock? Was the Soviet captain just clearing the area as a precaution, or had he seen the feather of wake from the periscope? The pinging continued, rhythmic and relentless. Whack, whack, whack. The USS Leon was coated in anechoic tiles, rubber mats designed to absorb sonar energy. But at this range, less than 1,000 yards, physics is unforgiving. If the destroyer was looking in the right spot, the return echo would be unmistakable. For 30 minutes, the American crew endured the hammering. They listened to the destroyer's propellers churn the water above them. They heard the distinct mechanical transient of the destroyer's rudder shifting as it executed a figure-8 search pattern. Nimitz knew the Soviet rules of engagement. If they were detected here, inside the 12-mile limit, there would be no warning shots. The destroyer would simply roll depth charges off the stern racks. The first indication of detection would be the hull buckling under the shockwave of high explosives. But the depth charges did not come. The destroyer completed its pattern, its active sonar fading as it moved off to the east to clear the next sector. The Soviet captain had been thorough, but the thermal layers of the water column and the background noise of the fleet parade had masked the American intruder. "Contact opening," the sonar chief reported, his voice trembling slightly. "Range 3,000 yards. Nimitz let out a breath he felt he had been holding for half an hour. "Bring her up," he ordered. "Periscope depth. Let's finish the job." It was a decision that defined the man. A lesser commander might have taken the close call as a warning and withdrawn. Nimitz treated it as an interruption. The intelligence requirements were not yet met. They had photographed the surface ships, but the primary target, the shadowed rumors of the Soviet submarine force, had not yet appeared. The USS Leon rose back to the surface. The periscope slid up. Chen returned to the eyepiece. The sun was higher now, the light harsh and clear. The harbor mouth was empty for a moment, the water churning from the wake of the destroyer. Then new shapes began to emerge from the mist. They were low, black, and menacing. They did not have the high superstructures of the cruisers or the sleek lines of the destroyers. They were the apex predators of the Soviet Navy. "Captain," Chen whispered, "I have submarines. Nuclear. Surfaced in line formation." Nimitz looked at the monitor that replicated the periscope view. He saw 5 silhouettes moving out of the base. Intelligence estimates had suggested that the Soviet Pacific Fleet possessed perhaps 3 of the new Charlie-class nuclear attack submarines. The camera clicked rapidly, the film winding through the spools. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 5 of them, and they were not just transiting. They were showing off. As the submarines passed the reviewing stand, they maneuvered, turning slightly to present their profiles to Admiral Gorshkov. In doing so, they presented their profiles to the USS Leon. The Mark 118 camera captured details that had been invisible to satellites. It saw the distinct bulge of the missile hangar behind the sail. It saw the hydrodynamic fairing of the sail itself. But most critically, as the submarines turned, the camera caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the waterline. The stern of the 3rd submarine rose slightly in the swell, exposing the top of the rudder and the propeller. This was the holy grail of naval intelligence. The acoustic signature of a submarine is largely determined by its screw, the number of blades, the curve, the pitch. If the U.S. Navy knew the shape of the propeller, they could predict the sound the submarine made. They could program their own torpedoes to home in on that specific frequency. Chen photographed the propellers. He photographed the sonar windows on the sails. He photographed the open hatches on the bridges where Soviet officers stood in dress uniforms, saluting their admiral, completely unaware that their secrets were being harvested frame by a vessel hovering less than a mile away. The Charlie-class photos would later rock the intelligence community. They revealed a submarine that was far more advanced than anticipated, a vessel capable of launching anti-ship cruise missiles while submerged, a capability the U.S. Navy did not yet possess. But as the last of the Charlie boats passed, the situation aboard the USS Leon shifted from observation to emergency. The parade was ending, but the security sweep was intensifying. The sonar room reported a new contact, not a ship, but something faster, buzzing like an angry hornet. "Air contact," sonar reported. "Rotors dipping. It's a helicopter." A Soviet Ka-25 Hormone anti-submarine helicopter was moving down the parade line, conducting a final sanitization sweep. It was hovering, dipping its sonar into the water, listening, and then moving on, and it was heading directly for the USS Leon. Nimitz looked at the chart. They were boxed in. To the east, the destroyer was still patrolling. To the west, the coast. Above them, the helicopter. The camera had done its work. The film magazines were full. The risk had finally exceeded the reward. "Down scope," Nimitz ordered. "Take us down. 400 feet. Rig for silent running." As the submarine slipped, beneath the waves, seeking the safety of the deep and the acoustic shadow of the ocean floor, the crew braced themselves. They had poked the bear in the eye. Now they had to get out of the cage before the bear realized it was bleeding. The appearance of the Charlie-class submarines. The critical moment of danger when a Soviet helicopter drops a sonobuoy directly into the USS Leon's blind spot in the decision to withdraw. As the hydraulic hiss of the periscope retraction faded into the silence of the control room, the USS Leon transitioned from a spectator to a hunted animal. Commander Nimitz had ordered the boat deep, seeking the safety of the thermal layers at 400 feet, but physics takes time. A submarine weighing 4,000 tons does not dive like a stone. It glides. The bow planes bit into the water, angling the ship downward, but for the next few minutes they were exposed, vulnerable, and moving through a sea that was rapidly becoming saturated with acoustic sensors. The contact report from the sonar shack was precise and terrifying. Helicopter is hovering, bearing 180 relative. Range closing. I have a splash. Splash is the sonar term for an object hitting the water. In this context, it meant only one thing: a sonobuoy. The Soviet K-25 Hormone helicopter had not just dropped a listening device at random. It had placed it with lethal geometric precision. The sonobuoy had entered the water directly astern of the USS Lapon, right in the submarine's acoustic shadow, the baffled zone behind the propeller where the submarine's own sonar cannot see, but where its wake is most turbulent. This was the worst possible scenario. The sonobuoy was now drifting in the water column, its hydrophone dangling on a wire, listening to the exact spot the submarine had just vacated. If the USS Lapon's propeller blades were cavitation, creating bubbles due to speed, or if a pump in the engine room was vibrating, the sonobuoy would hear it instantly. The signal would be relayed up to the helicopter, and the next splash would not be a sensor. It would be a torpedo. "All stop," Nimitz ordered. "Lock the shaft. Rig for absolute silence." The submarine coasted, its momentum carrying it forward as the propeller shaft was mechanically locked to prevent it from freewheeling in the current. The loss of propulsion meant a loss of control. Without water flowing over the diving planes, the submarine began to lose its lift. It became a dead weight, subject to the whims of buoyancy and gravity. Nimitz watched the depth gauge. They were passing 300 feet. He needed to go deeper to find the thermal layer that might shield them, but he couldn't use the engine to get there. He had to manage the descent by flooding auxiliary tanks, adding water weight to drag the ship down. But opening a valve creates noise. The rush of water into a tank sounds like a hiss. "Flood auxiliary 2. "Slowly," Nimitz whispered. The diving officer cracked the valve. A faint murmur of water moved through the pipes. In the silence of the ship, it sounded deafening. In the sonar shack, the operators pressed their headphones against their skulls until it hurt. They could hear the sonobuoy, transmitting. It was a high-pitched electronic warble, searching for a return. They could hear the beat of the helicopter's rotors overhead, the sound transmitting through the surface interface. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was hovering. It was waiting. For 10 minutes, the 107 men aboard the USS Lapon ceased to exist as individuals. They became statues. In the engine room, the machinist mates froze with their hands on the throttles. In the galley, the cooks stood perfectly still. No one spoke. No one adjusted their footing. They breathed in shallow, controlled rhythms. The air circulation fans had been secured to eliminate the hum of the motors. The temperature in the boat began to rise, the air growing thick and stagnant. The submarine drifted deeper, 350 feet, 400 feet. The hull groaned. It was a single metallic pop, the sound of a steel frame compressing under the increasing pressure of the ocean. To the crew, it sounded like a gunshot. Nimitz winced. If the sonobuoy heard that, the torpedo was already on its way. He looked at the sonar chief. The chief held up a hand, listening. 5 seconds passed. 10. No splash, no high-speed screws of a weapon in the water. The ocean background noise, the distant shrimp crackle, the grinding of the shore ice, had masked the sound. "Air contact is moving off," the chief whispered. "Opening range to the west." The helicopter had lost interest. It had not detected the ghost in its backyard. It moved on to sanitize the next sector of the parade route. Nimitz exhaled, a long, slow release of tension. "Unlock the shaft," he ordered. "Make turns for 3 knots. Let's get the hell out of here. The withdrawal was a masterclass in evasion. The mission was technically complete. The film magazines were full of the Charlie-class and Kresta-class images. Now, the definition of success changed from collection to survival. They were still 12 miles inside Soviet territorial waters, and the entire Pacific Fleet was maneuvering around them. Nimitz did not run for the open ocean immediately. Speed creates noise. Instead, he took the USS Lapon deeper, down to 600 feet, and turned south, hugging the contour of the Kamchatka coastline. He used the topography of the seabed to hide the ship's acoustic signature. The ocean floor off Petropavlovsk is rugged, scarred by volcanic activity. Nimitz guided the submarine into the acoustic valleys, putting ridges of rock between his ship and the patrolling Soviet destroyers. He played the thermal layers like an instrument. When the bathythermograph indicated a strong temperature gradient, a layer that would reflect sonar, he positioned the ship beneath it, using the cold water as a ceiling to bounce enemy pings away. At 1400 hours, they reached the gap in the Kuril Island chain, the same turbulent channel they had used to enter. The tide had turned. The water was rushing out of the Sea of Okhotsk, creating the same chaotic roar that had masked their entry. Nimitz rode the current out. The submarine was buffeted by the flow, rolling 10 degrees to port and starboard as it fought the eddies. The sonar screens were white with noise. They were blind and deaf, trusting in the navigation plot and the assumption that the Soviets couldn't hear them either. As they cleared the island chain and entered the deep water of the North Pacific, the acoustic environment cleared. They were back in the open ocean. They had crossed the fence. "Secure from ultra-quiet," Nimitz ordered. "Resume standard watch rotation." The ship came back to life. The fans spun up, scrubbing the CO2 from the air. The galley fires were lit. The smell of fresh coffee began to drift through the passageways, replacing the scent of fear and sweat. But the work was not done. Lieutenant Commander Chen, the intelligence officer, retreated to the specialized darkroom installed during the Mare Island refit. The canisters of exposed film were more valuable than the submarine itself. If they had been detected and attacked, Nimitz's standing orders were to jettison the film canisters via the signal ejector, weighted to sink, ensuring the Soviets could not recover the proof of the intrusion. Now Chen began the delicate chemical process of developing the take. Under the red safe light of the darkroom, the first images began to emerge from the developer bath. They were stunning. The resolution of the Mark 118 system was everything the Naval Research Laboratory had promised. Chen held up a wet negative of the Charlie-class submarine. The image was crisp. He could see the weld lines on the missile hatches. He could see the texture of the anechoic tiles on the sail, but it was the stern shot that caused him to catch his breath. The camera had captured the propeller. For years, the CIA and naval intelligence had debated the capabilities of the Charlie-class. Was it faster than American boats? Was it quieter? The geometry of the propeller was the key to answering those questions. The number of blades, the skew, the pitch, these factors determine the cavitation speed, the point at which a submarine becomes noisy. Chen looked at the image through a magnifying loupe. The propeller design was advanced, far more advanced than Western analysts had predicted. The blade curvature suggested that the Soviets had solved complex hydrodynamic problems that American engineers thought were years away from realization in Moscow. This was the Charlie shock. The photos proved that the technological gap was narrowing. The Soviets weren't just building more submarines, they were building better ones. The Charlie class wasn't a crude copy of Western designs. It was a lethal innovator, capable of launching missiles from underwater, a capability that threatened the dominance of American surface groups. And there was more. The photos of the Kresta-II cruisers revealed the fire control radars for their SSN-3 missiles. The dish angles and sizes allowed analysts to calculate the frequency bands. This meant the U.S. Navy could now tune its electronic jamming equipment to the exact frequency needed to blind the Soviet missiles. As the USS Lapon steamed toward Pearl Harbor, conducting the 12-day transit in relative safety, the crew began to decompress. The adrenaline crash was palpable. Men slept for 12 hours straight. The mood in the mess decks was lighter but guarded. They knew they had done something historic, but they also knew they could never talk about it. Nimitz spent the transit writing his patrol report. He had to document every contact, every maneuver, every decision. But he also took time to walk the ship, speaking to the sonar men who had held the line during the helicopter attack and the machinists who had kept the shaft silent. He knew that the technology, the camera, the nuclear reactor, the hull steel, was useless without the discipline of the crew. They had spent hours as a hole in the water, a void where life existed only by sheer force of will. On October 26, 1969, the USS Lapon passed the sea buoy at Pearl Harbor. The mission was over. The submarine was no longer a spy in enemy territory. It was just another gray shape returning to port. But inside the sealed canisters being offloaded by armed guards, the balance of the Cold War had shifted. The Americans had seen the giants, and now they knew exactly how to kill them. As the weeks unfolded following the USS Lapon's return to the tropical warmth of Pearl Harbor, the submarine sat quietly at the pier, its hull streaked with the salt and algae of a long deployment. To the casual observer, it was just another machine of war undergoing routine maintenance. But thousands of miles away, inside the secure, windowless vaults of the National Maritime Intelligence Center in Suitland, Maryland, the cargo that Commander Nimitz and his crew had risked their lives to retrieve was detonating like a slow-motion bomb within the U.S. naval establishment. The arrival of the film canisters set off one of the most intensive intelligence analysis efforts of the Cold War. Over 300 specialized photo interpreters, naval architects, and acoustic engineers were pulled from other projects to dissect the images captured by the Mark 118 camera. The photographs were spread out on light tables, magnified, digitized, and scrutinized inch by inch. What they found did not just update the Navy's threat assessment. It fundamentally rewrote the playbook for the next 20 years of naval warfare. The immediate shock came from the analysis of the Charlie-class submarines. Before the Lapon's mission, American intelligence estimates regarding Soviet cruise missile capabilities were based on conjecture and blurry satellite outlines. The photos taken by Lieutenant Commander Chen changed everything. They revealed the precise geometry of the missile hangar doors built into the submarine's hull. By measuring the size of the hatches against known reference points on the hull, analysts calculated the dimensions of the missiles inside. The conclusion was terrifying. The Soviets had deployed the SSN-7 Starbright missile system, a weapon capable of being launched from a submerged submarine to strike surface ships 35 miles away. At the time, the U.S. Navy had no equivalent capability. American submarines used torpedoes. They had to get close to kill. The Soviets could stand off and fire from over the horizon. This intelligence gap triggered a technological emergency in the Pentagon. The photographs from the Lapon became the primary exhibit in the argument to develop a counterweapon. The direct result was the acceleration of the American submarine-launched cruise missile program. The iconic Tomahawk missile, which would later become the standard strike weapon of the U.S. fleet, owes its existence in part to the fear generated by the images Nimitz brought back from Petropavlovsk. The U.S. Navy realized it could not allow the Soviets to hold the monopoly on long-range underwater strike capability. The impact on surface warfare was equally profound. The photographs of the Kresta-2 cruisers provided the first clear look at the top-sail three-dimensional radar systems. American electronic warfare officers studied the shape of the radar dishes, calculating their scan rates and frequency bands. This allowed the U.S. to tune its jamming equipment, the ANSLQ-32 systems found on every American destroyer, to specifically blind the Soviet sensors. Because of the Lapon, American captains now knew exactly which electronic frequency would turn a Soviet cruiser's radar screen into a wall of static. But beyond the technical specifications, the mission validated a new strategic reality. The intelligence proved that the Soviet Navy was no longer a defensive coastal force. The modifications documented on their destroyers and the range of their new missiles indicated a doctrine of blue water aggression. They were building a fleet designed to sever the sea lanes between the United States and Europe. While the admirals and politicians digested the intelligence, the men who had gathered it were left to process the human cost of the operation. Commander Nimitz received a classified commendation, a ribbon for his uniform that he could not explain to his wife or children. The crew of the USS Lapon was sworn to absolute secrecy. They had been to the dragon's lair, poked it in the eye, and returned, but they were forbidden from telling the story. This silence exacted a toll. The psychological pressure of submarine intelligence operations, the Spec Ops boats, was unique. These men lived in a state of cognitive dissonance. They were peacetime sailors who had experienced the adrenaline and terror of combat conditions without ever firing a shot. They had heard the active sonar of the enemy hunting them. They had looked through the periscope at weapons designed to kill them. Yet, when they returned to port, they had to blend back into the mundane routine of drills and inspections, carrying the weight of their near-death experiences alone. Divorce rates among the crews of these specialized submarines were notoriously high. The stress of the silent service, combined with the inability to share the burden of their experiences with their families, created a barrier that was difficult to overcome. They were heroes in a war that officially did not exist. The legacy of the Lapon's mission also served as a grim warning about the dangers of the era. While Nimitz had succeeded, others were not always so lucky. In the years following 1969, the game of cat and mouse beneath the waves intensified. In 1970, the USS Gato was detected during a similar spy mission near the Soviet coast and endured a harrowing pursuit that lasted 18 hours, suffering damage to her propulsion system before escaping. In 1974, the USS James Madison collided with a Soviet submarine in the North Sea. These incidents, known only to a few, highlighted the razor-thin margin for error. The Lapon had survived by feet and seconds. If the helicopter pilot off Petropavlovsk had lingered for another minute, or if the destroyer captain had been slightly more aggressive with his depth charges, the USS Lapon would have been nothing more than an oil slick and a diplomatic crisis that could have triggered World War III. As the Cold War ground on, the technology of underwater espionage evolved. The Mark 118 camera gave way to digital sensors and fiber optic periscopes. The blind cameras were replaced by satellite uplinks that could transmit images in real time. But the template established by the Lapon, the audacity to go where the enemy felt safest, remained the core doctrine of the submarine force. Commander Chester Nimitz Jr. retired from the Navy in 1983, his career capped by the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference. He watched as the Tomahawk missiles, weapons born from the intelligence he gathered, became the teeth of the U.S. Navy. He watched as the Aegis combat system was deployed to counter the missile threats he had photographed. He never sought the spotlight. Like his father before him, he understood that duty was its own justification. It was not until 2009, decades after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, that the Navy finally declassified portions of the mission. The crew of the USS Lapon held a reunion at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut in 2010. For the first time, old men with gray hair and hearing aids could stand together and speak the truth aloud. They shared stories of the parade of giants, of the helicopter that hovered over their heads, and of the captain who held his nerve when the world was listening. They honored the shipmates who had passed away before the secrecy was lifted. Men who died without ever being able to tell their sons and daughters that they had been on the front lines of history. The story of the USS Lapon is a testament to the power of information. In a conflict defined by nuclear stalemates and proxy wars, The most decisive battles were often fought not with explosives, but with shutter clicks and magnetic tape. The photos taken on that October morning did not sink any Soviet ships, but they destroyed the Soviet advantage of surprise. They allowed the United States to prepare, to adapt, and ultimately to prevail. The ocean has closed over the wake of the USS Lapon. The Soviet fleet she photographed is largely rusted away, scrapped in the chaotic years following the collapse of the USSR. But the lesson remains. Peace is not a natural state. It is maintained by vigilance. It is bought by the courage of a few hundred men in a steel tube, breathing recycled air, waiting in the dark to bring the truth to the light. When historians write the final accounting of the Cold War, they often focus on the summits in Reykjavik or the fall of the wall. But the victory was also won in the silence of the deep by men like Chester Nimitz Jr., who proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon you can carry is a camera, and the greatest victory is the one that no one hears until the war is over. The mission of the USS Lapon stands as a singular example of the duality of the Cold War, a conflict that was simultaneously frozen in political gridlock and burning hot in the shadows. The audacity of taking a submarine into the heart of an enemy harbor to photograph their fleet is a reminder that deterrence was not a passive strategy. It required active, terrifying engagement. There is a profound respect due to the crews of these vessels, both American and Soviet. They operated in an environment hostile to human life, inside machines of immense complexity, under the constant threat of instant annihilation. They were the silent professionals who held the line. As we look back on this era, the story of the Lapon offers a crucial insight. Ignorance is the most dangerous state of all. By illuminating the capabilities of the Soviet Navy, Nimitz and his crew removed the fear of the unknown. They replaced panic with data. In doing so, they stabilized the standoff. They didn't just take pictures, they bought time. And in the nuclear age, time was the only commodity that mattered. Thank you for spending part of your day with us to uncover this hidden chapter of history. If this deep dive into the silent war beneath the waves meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.